Well, I will not be opening with a children's song because that didn't get passed down to me from my dad. I don't have that talent. But since there's no children's church and kids are here, I decided I'd preach on my favorite story from when I was a kid, David and Goliath. Because who doesn't like a good story about giants? Because giants have fascinated people throughout human history. The Greeks had the legends of the Titans, who are the children of the gods. There's nursery rhymes and stories about Jack and the Beanstalk, about a man-eating giant that lives in the clouds that I don't know why we tell that to kids. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s like me, maybe you're familiar with a modern-day giant named Andre, professional wrestler and who I think should be an award-winning actor. But the most famous giant is Goliath. And I imagine Israelite children probably reenacted this story just like kids today might reenact superhero stories. So the story is found in 1 Samuel 17. So the setup is armies of Israel are facing off against the armies of their enemies, the Philistines. And they're both camped on either side of the valley. No one's really doing any fighting. They're just yelling. So I'm going to pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 4. It says, "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us.' Then the Philistines said, 'This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other.' On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified." So right off the bat, we're introduced to the villain of the story, a mighty warrior named Goliath. And he stood about 9'9". His armor weighed 125 pounds. Now, most of us could probably barely move with that extra weight, let alone fight a battle. I mean, that's how I kind of feel after Christmas. His iron spearhead weighed 15 pounds. So it's no wonder King Saul and the whole Israelite army was terrified. But the biblical story actually paints Goliath in an even more sinister light. Because according to the biblical authors, giants aren't just tall humans. They trace their origins to an act of spiritual rebellion, to the fallen angels. And that's a weird rabbit trail that I don't have time to get into. But there's a dark spiritual reality to the giants. And the author of 1 Samuel dials up the tension. Because Goliath is described as having bronze scale armor. And in Hebrew, the word bronze and the word serpent are the same letters. So he's portraying Goliath as a giant, scaly serpent. And here's why that matters. It goes all the way back to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, the first humans, lived in the paradise of God. They had abundant life. God shared his very life with them. God created humanity in his own image and said it was very good. But then they ruined things for everyone. Because in Genesis 3, we're introduced to another character, which is simply called the serpent. Later in the Bible, the serpent is identified as Satan. And when you get to Revelation, it's a giant 7-headed dragon. And the serpent twisted God's word, deceived humanity, and caused them to sin. And as a result, sin and death entered the world. Humanity was exiled from God's presence, cut off from the life-giving presence of God. And because of this, God cursed the serpent. And here's what God said in Genesis 3:14-15. He said, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." So it doesn't mean snakes used to have legs. That's not the point. Because to eat dust, crawl on your belly, that means he's assigned to the realm of death. And God declares, from this point forward in human history, it's the righteous offspring of the woman will be at constant war with the wicked seed of the serpent. It'll be a continual struggle, no side really gaining the upper hand. But a day was coming when the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent once and for all. But in so doing, the serpent would strike his heel. And I have it on a good authority from my South African friends that even if you step on the head of a dead snake, its venom can still kill you. So the serpent will be overcome through death. All of creation was subject to death and decay. All of creation eagerly awaited the day when the Messiah would crush the serpent. So here on the battlefield, the serpent has once again reared its ugly head. Goliath is portrayed as the physical embodiment of the serpent. There is a dark spiritual evil present. That Israel's battle wasn't just against flesh and blood. Maybe if it was a tall human, they could just throw a spear at him and be done with it. But he was so much more. Because if your battle is a spiritual battle, swords and spears and javelins are completely useless. And so the armies of Israel hid in fear. When the seed of the serpent arrived, they needed someone to fight the battle on their behalf. They needed someone to crush the giant's head and give them victory. No one was to be found. The battle was at a stalemate. Day after day after day, Goliath defied the armies of God. Day after day, he was met with silence from the ranks of Israel. There was no one to stand against the power of the serpent. For 40 days, Goliath went unchallenged. For 40 days, the Israelites cowered in fear. And in the midst of this battle, stepped a young shepherd boy named David, clearly not old enough to serve in the army. His older brothers were there, and he was bringing them supplies, but his job was the sheep. But David was not an ordinary boy. In fact, he was the next king of Israel. A few chapters earlier, David was anointed as Israel's next king. In effect, David was Israel's Messiah, because Messiah is a Hebrew term that means anointed one. So in the midst of this battlefield, the serpent, defying the armies of God, enters God's anointed king. Would this boy with zero military background crush the head of the serpent? Would he do what everyone else failed to? There was a second anointed one on the scene, and his name was Saul. And he was the current king of Israel. Several years earlier, the people of Israel got tired of being the only nation without a king. They got tired of having God as their king. And so they started whining and went to the prophet Samuel and said, "Give us a king so we can be like everyone else." So God listened to them and gave them a king, gave them Saul. And what qualified him to lead the people? It says Saul was handsome, and he stood a head taller than everyone. That's not great qualifications. But they wanted a king like the other nations, so God gave them a tall man, because some of these ancient nations had giants ruling over them. So you get a tall guy. That's your qualification. So Saul was completely unqualified for the task. He didn't even want to be king. But after Samuel anointed him with oil, the Spirit of God came upon Saul, and he was transformed into a new person. After that, he went out conquering the enemies of Israel. God was with him. Until 7 days later, Saul disobeyed God, and God rejected him as king. He lasted 7 days as the legitimate king of Israel. And God says, because you have disobeyed me, I have anointed a new king, a man after my own heart. And that was David. So when Goliath challenged the armies of Israel, it should have been Saul answering the challenge. He was the anointed king. He was the representative of the people. He was tall. Not Goliath tall, but taller than the rest. But instead of going into battle, Saul said, well, how about I just bribe someone? He says, if you kill Goliath, I'll give you great wealth, and you can marry a princess, and your family will be tax-free. Like if someone told me they'll give me a wife and tax-free status, well, I might go fight a giant. I mean, I bring more than a few little rocks, but David arrived at the Israelite camp just as Goliath was issuing his challenge. And David was outraged. In verse 26, David says, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David seems to have been embarrassed for Israel. So don't you know who your God is? How can you let this giant defy the armies of the living God? Someone needs to do something. And eventually word reached Saul that this little boy was wanting to fight the giant. But David looked past Goliath to see the God he served. And when Saul tried to talk him out of it, David said, starting in verse 32, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, you are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So what was the source of David's confidence? God had delivered him from his enemies in the past. Now today, parents would probably get reported if they sent their young son out to fight bears and lions. But that was David's job. And he reasoned, well, if God saved me from the mouth of the lion and the bear, a giant is no more a challenge to God. He looked back at all God had done on his behalf, and that gave him the faith to trust God in the future and the present. And David's response was exactly what Saul's response should have been, because the Israelites had a long history of defeating giants in battle. After the Israelites finished 40 years wandering in the desert after being delivered from Egypt, they were attacked by a giant king named Og. And Og's bed in the Bible is recorded, either his bed or his tomb was about 14 feet long. So he attacked Israel. And Moses and Joshua defeated him and took all his territory as their own. When it came time for the Israelites to enter the promised land and take possession of it, well, the problem was the land was full of giants. And so under Joshua's leadership, God drove out the giants from the land, giving his people victory. All Saul had to do was look back at all God had already done to know that Goliath was no challenge, that God is unchanging. But Saul was unable to see past the problem in front of his eyes. So David set out and took 5 smooth stones. Now, there's probably countless sermons that have been preached about the 5 smooth stones that say, these 5 principles will help you defeat giants in your life. And that is completely missing the point of the story. Because what you don't find out till later in the story is Goliath had 4 brothers. There were 4 other giants living in the land. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So if this is what's going through David's mind, he's saying, not only will I take out Goliath, but I'm coming for your brothers. God's going to give me victory over you, and I'm going to finish the job. And in 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20, we actually read how David and his mighty men defeated these giants. So, time for the battle. Picking up in verse 45, it says, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with a sword. So did you catch the symbolism there? The Messiah, the anointed king, crushed the head of the serpent. Intentionally. Stone struck Goliath in the forehead. David cut off his head. He crushed the serpent underfoot. So this is the part of the sermon where I'm told we ask the question, so what? I've been here a few times. Because often the lesson of David and Goliath is, with God's help, you can defeat the giants in your life. And these giants may be referred to as any major obstacles, trials, struggles we face, whether it's health issues, financial burdens, illness, addictions, broken relationships. And while it's true that God can and does deliver us from such things, that's not the point of the story. When I was in Bible college, one of my professors reframed the story in a way that basically changed everything. Because we all want to be David. We all want to be the giant killer. But that's not who we're meant to identify with. We are the terrified Israelite army, powerless to defeat our enemies, cowering in fear. Only the giant we face is not just a mighty warrior. Our enemy is Satan and all the powers of darkness. Our enemy is death and the grave. Our enemy is sin that enslaves us. Our enemies are beyond our ability to defeat. We cannot defeat a spiritual enemy. We cannot forgive our own sins. We cannot raise ourselves from the dead. So like the terrified Israelites, we need God's anointed king to save us. We needed someone to fight the battle for us. And so God sent his son, Jesus, into the world. For thousands of years, the spiritual battle had been at a stalemate. Even the most godly examples of humanity, like Moses and David, failed incredibly. Likewise, no matter how great the evil in the world, it was never successful in overcoming the people of God, at least not entirely. It's a constant battle, neither side achieving victory. until Jesus entered the scene. Jesus, the Son of David. On the cross, Jesus paid the penalty for our sins, paying the price of our redemption from the powers of darkness. Jesus rose from the dead, victorious over the power of the grave, disarming the powers. Because what's the worst that someone can do? Kill you? Jesus overcame death. They're disarmed. Then Jesus ascended to heaven, where he was given all authority in heaven and on earth. Now here's a little bit of speculation, but I find this interesting, so take it for what it's worth. But I came across a theory that says that the hill where Jesus was crucified on is the hill where the skull of Goliath was buried. Just speculation, but they say that because the hill is called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And its name is from the same Hebrew root word that Goliath comes from. And David took Goliath's head to the city. But regardless of that, if that's true, the picture is the same, that as Jesus hung on the cross, the head of the serpent was crushed beneath his nail-pierced feet. Once David fought and won the battle on Israel's behalf, the whole army entered the fight. David had slain the giant, and as a result, all the people shared in his victory. Because of what David accomplished on their behalf, suddenly they were no longer terrified. They stepped out in faith, knowing the battle was won. So what's a more powerful message from the story? That with God's help, you can defeat the giants in your life? Or that because of Jesus, the giants are already slain? Because wherever we might rate our own personal struggles, I would guarantee that whatever we face is a far lot less than being enslaved to the powers of Satan, sin, and death. And if those enemies are defeated at the cross, there is nothing beyond our God's power to save. When we focus on the struggles right before us, as real and difficult as they are, it's easy to become discouraged. Like Saul and the Israelite army, we so easily forget the victory that has already been won. But when we remember all that Jesus has accomplished, just as David remembered how God delivered him from the lions and the bears, suddenly our problems are put in the right perspective. Because if Jesus has entered the fight on our behalf, if he has won the victory already, nothing is impossible for our God. So I'll invite the worship band to come back up. And I'm just going to leave you with a few words from a song called You've Already Won. And the words, I think, are very fitting. It says, I'm fighting a battle. You've already won. No matter what comes my way, I will overcome. I don't know what you're doing, but I know what you've done. I'm fighting a battle. You've already won.